The bitter January wind cut through Martin's thin jacket like it wasn't even there. He pulled the worn fabric tighter around his shoulders, watching his breath form small clouds in the frigid air. The green metal bench beneath him had long since leached away what little warmth he'd brought to it. His arthritis-stiffened fingers curled around the handle of his old suitcase, the same one he'd used on business trips 30 years ago, back when he had an office with his name on the door and a future that seemed secure. "You can't live here anymore, Dad. We need the space." His son David's words still rang in his ears, sharp as the wind. "Tracy's pregnant again, and this house isn't big enough for all of us." Martin had raised David in that house, had carried him up those stairs when he was sick with chicken pox, had built him a tree house in the backyard maple that still stood proud and tall, even if the tree house was long gone. Now here he sat in Jefferson Park, watching joggers hurry past in their expensive athletic wear, averting their eyes from the old man who clearly didn't belong. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange that reminded Martin of Tracy's baby shower last month. He'd sat in the corner, watching his daughter-in-law open gifts, while David hovered nearby, both of them stealing glances at him when they thought he wasn't looking. Maybe they'd been planning it even then. His Social Security check wouldn't come for another week. The motel down on Lancaster Avenue might take pity on him, but their rates would eat through his savings in no time. His sister June lived in Florida, but he hadn't spoken to her since their fight at Mom's funeral 5 years ago. A young woman in scrubs walked past, then stopped and turned back. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she carried a canvas bag that seemed ready to split at the seams. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion Martin remembered from his own working days. "Sir?" Her voice was gentle. "Are you all right?" Martin tried to smile, to summon up the dignity he'd once worn as easily as his suits. "Just enjoying the evening air," he said, but his voice cracked, betraying him. The woman, her ID badge read Elena Martinez, RN, shifted her bag to her other shoulder. "In this weather, without a proper coat?" She glanced at his suitcase, then at his reddened hands. Understanding flickered across her face. "I'm heading to the diner across the street for some coffee," she said. "Would you join me?" My treat. Pride warred with desperation in Martin's chest. The temperature was dropping faster than his resolve. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Please," Elena said. "I just finished a 12-hour shift, and I hate eating alone." She smiled, and something in her expression reminded him of his late wife, Sarah. That same quiet kindness that saw through pretense. The diner was a throwback to better days, with red vinyl booths and chrome trim that caught the fluorescent lights. The warmth hit Martin like a wave as they stepped inside, making his cold, numbed fingers tingle painfully. "My dad was a contractor," Elena said as they settled into a booth. "Worked his whole life building other people's dreams. Then the recession hit in '08, and everything fell apart." She paused as the waitress poured their coffee. He was too proud to ask for help at first. Martin wrapped his hands around the hot mug, letting the warmth seep into his bones. "What happened to him?" "He moved in with me. Fought it every step of the way." She stirred cream into her coffee. "Now he helps me keep my plants alive and teaches my kids how to make his famous enchiladas. Life's funny that way." Martin stared into his coffee, watching the ripples spread from the center. "My son, he's not a bad person. He just..." The word stuck in his throat. "Sometimes good people make painful choices," Elena said. "Doesn't make those choices right." She pulled out her phone, checked something, then looked back at Martin. "Listen, I know this might sound strange, but I volunteer at the Senior Resource Center on Oak Street. They have emergency housing assistance, counseling, legal aid, everything you might need to get back on your feet. I don't need charity," Martin said automatically, then winced at how ungrateful it sounded. Elena's eyes crinkled with understanding. "It's not charity. It's community. We help each other because that's what humans do, or at least it's what we should do." The waitress brought their food, a grilled cheese sandwich for Martin that Elena had insisted on ordering when his stomach growled, and a chicken salad for her. As they ate, Elena told him about her work at the hospital, about the patients who touched her heart and the ones who drove her crazy. She talked about her father's recovery, how he'd found purpose again teaching ESL classes at the community center. Martin found himself sharing too, about his years as an accountant, about Sarah's battle with cancer, about David as a little boy who used to wait by the window for his father to come home from work. The memories flowed easier with each bite of food, with each sip of coffee that seemed to thaw more than just his body. "The center opens at 9 tomorrow morning," Elena said finally. "I could meet you there, if you'd like." Martin looked down at his empty plate, at his weathered hands with their liver spots and swollen knuckles. He thought about David, about the grandson or granddaughter he might never know, about how quickly pride could turn into loneliness. "Why are you helping me?" he asked quietly. Elena gathered her things, pulling her scrubs jacket back on. "Because someone helped my father when he needed it. Because sometimes we all need a bridge to get from where we are to where we need to be." She pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. "That's my cell number. The diner opens at 7. I'll buy you breakfast before we head to the center." Martin took the card, his vision blurring slightly. "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank me by letting us help," Elena said, standing up. She hesitated, then added, "And there's a shelter on Pine Street that has open beds tonight. It's clean, safe, and they don't ask too many questions. I can drop you there on my way home." Martin thought of his empty house, of David and Tracy sleeping in the master bedroom that had once been his and Sarah's, of the treehouse that was gone but the tree that remained, of how Sarah would have scolded him for sitting in the cold rather than asking for help. "Okay," he said finally. "The shelter sounds good." The word shelter caught in his throat, but Elena pretended not to notice. Outside, her car was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and hand sanitizer. As they drove through the darkening streets, Martin watched the city lights blur past, each one a tiny beacon in the night. The shelter was better than he'd feared. The staff spoke to him with respect, and his roommate for the night was a former engineer who'd lost everything in a divorce. They stayed up late talking about the space race and how technology had changed the world. Morning came with weak winter sunlight and the smell of coffee from the shelter's kitchen. Martin washed up in the communal bathroom, straightened his clothes as best he could, and waited by the front door until he saw Elena's car pull up. She looked fresh despite the early hour, her hair neat and her smile bright. "Ready for breakfast?" she asked, as if meeting homeless elderly men for breakfast was something she did every day. "Ready," Martin said, and was surprised to find he meant it. Over pancakes and eggs, Elena explained how the Senior Resource Center worked. They had social workers who could help him apply for housing assistance, legal advisors who could review his rights regarding his home, and counselors who could mediate family conflicts. "Sometimes," she said, cutting her pancakes into neat triangles, "families need an outside perspective to find their way back to each other." Martin thought about David as a teenager, how they'd drifted apart after Sarah died, how they'd both retreated into their grief instead of helping each other through it. Maybe this wasn't just about the house. Maybe it never had been. "I think I pushed him away first," Martin admitted quietly. "After Sarah, I couldn't bear to see her in his face, in his smile. So I stopped looking." Elena reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Then maybe it's time to start looking again." The Senior Resource Center was housed in an old Victorian building with a wheelchair ramp discreetly curved around its side. Inside, the hardwood floors gleamed with care, and comfortable chairs filled the waiting area. It felt more like a home than an institution. Carol, the intake coordinator, had kind eyes and silver hair. She listened to Martin's story without judgment, taking notes and occasionally asking gentle questions. When he mentioned David, she nodded thoughtfully. "Family mediation is one of our specialties," she said. "But first, let's make sure you have a safe place to stay while we work things out. We have a partnership with a transitional housing complex nearby. Private rooms, shared kitchen. Would you be interested in looking at it?" Martin glanced at Elena, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Yes," he said, "I would." The transitional housing turned out to be a converted motel, its rooms simple but clean. Martin's room had a small desk by the window and a view of a courtyard where residents had planted a community garden. Even in winter, there were signs of care: bird feeders, winter kale, carefully pruned rose bushes waiting for spring. "We have weekly community dinners," explained Tom, the housing coordinator. "Movie nights too. Nobody's required to participate, but you might be surprised how many friendships start over a shared meal." Martin set his suitcase down, looking at the neat twin bed with its blue comforter. It wasn't home, but it was far better than a park bench. And it was a beginning. "The social worker can see you this afternoon," Elena said from the doorway. "I can stay until then if you'd like company." "You've already done so much," Martin protested, but Elena was already pulling a deck of cards from her bag. "My shift doesn't start until tonight," she said, settling at the small table. "And I play a mean game of gin rummy." 3 hands later, Martin found himself laughing for the first time in days. Elena was telling him about her father's unsuccessful attempts to teach her brothers to cook, complete with the story of a spectacular kitchen fire that had resulted in a new family rule about supervised cooking only. "He still makes them help with dinner," she said, laying down a winning hand, "but now it's more about keeping the family together than teaching culinary skills. Sometimes the meal is just an excuse for the conversation." Martin thought about Sunday dinners with David's family, how they'd grown increasingly silent over the years. The social worker, Miss Reynolds, asked questions that made Martin think, not just about the immediate crisis, but about the years leading up to it. About his relationship with David before Sarah's death, about the silences that had grown between them like weeds in an untended garden. "Would you be open to having David come in for a session?" she asked. "Sometimes neutral ground can make difficult conversations easier." Martin twisted his wedding ring, a habit he'd never broken. "What if he won't come?" "Then we work with what we have," she said simply. "But in my experience, most people want to mend bridges. They just don't know how to take the first step." She helped him draft a text message to David, just a few lines letting him know where Martin was staying and that he'd like to talk when David was ready. Martin's fingers trembled as he pressed send. The response came that evening as Martin was unpacking his meager belongings. His phone buzzed and there was David's name on the screen. "Is this place safe? Are you okay?" The concern in those simple questions made Martin's throat tight. He typed back, "Yes to both. The people here are kind." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Tracy's worried about you. We both are. I'm sorry it happened like this." Martin sat heavily on the bed. Sorry it happened like this wasn't the same as sorry it happened, but it was something. An acknowledgement, a crack in the wall they'd built between them. "Could we talk?" Martin wrote. "Maybe coffee somewhere?" The response came faster this time. "Tomorrow? That diner on Park Street, 1 p.m.? "I'll be there," Martin replied, and felt something like hope stir in his chest. Elena brought him a warmer jacket that morning, claiming it was her father's old one that he never wore anymore. Martin suspected this wasn't entirely true, but he accepted it with gratitude. The diner looked different in daylight, less like a refuge and more like what it was. A simple place where simple conversations could change lives. David arrived exactly on time, looking uncomfortable in his business casual clothes. He'd lost weight since Martin had last really looked at him. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Hi, Dad," he said, sliding into the booth. "Hi, son." They ordered coffee and sat in silence for a moment, both searching for words to bridge the gap between them. Finally, David spoke. "Tracy's having twins, we found out last week. I panicked. About space, about money, about everything." Martin absorbed this news, thinking of Sarah and how she would have been overjoyed at the prospect of twins. That's wonderful news, David. And scary, I imagine." David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his teenage self that Martin's heart ached. "I handled it all wrong, Dad. I know that. But everything's been wrong between us for so long. I didn't know how to make it right." "Since your mother died," Martin said softly. "Since before that," David corrected. "Since you started working 60-hour weeks, and I started getting into trouble just to get your attention. Since Mom became the only bridge between us and then she was gone." The waitress refilled their coffee cups. Neither of them touched them. "I miss her," David said. "And I miss you, even though you're right here." "I've been meeting with a counselor at the senior center," Martin said. "She's helped me see some things more clearly. About how I shut down after your mother died. How I stopped being a father when you needed one most." David fiddled with his spoon. "Tracy wanted me to ask, would you consider coming to live with her parents? They have a finished basement apartment. It's not huge, but it's private. And the twins, they should know their grandfather." Martin felt tears prick at his eyes. "I'd like that. But David, we need to fix us first. Really fix us. The center has family counseling. Would you come with me?" David looked up, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Yeah, Dad, I would." They talked for 2 more hours, about everything and nothing. About the twins, about Sarah, about the treehouse that David's own children might play in someday. A week later, Martin sat in Elena's father's kitchen, watching the old man teach his grandchildren how to make tortillas. Elena had insisted on having him over for Sunday dinner, and now he understood why. This was what healing looked like: flour-dusted counters, children's laughter, the smell of good food and family. "You look better," Elena said, handing him a cup of coffee. "How did the first counseling session go?" "Hard," Martin admitted. "But good. David and I were trying. That's something." "That's everything," she corrected. "My father always says that trying is the most important part." Through the window, Martin could see the sunset painting the sky the same orange it had been that day in the park. But now, instead of an ending, it felt like a beginning. In the spring, Martin moved into the basement apartment at his in-laws. The twins were born in May, a boy and a girl. He helped David paint their nursery, and they talked while they worked, really talked, about all the years they'd lost and all the years ahead. Sometimes he still visited the senior center, volunteering now instead of seeking help. He'd see new faces, lost and afraid as he had been, and he'd think of Elena in that cold January night. Sometimes we all need a bridge, he'd tell them, and mean it. The maple tree in David's backyard sprouted new leaves, and David talked about building a new treehouse. Martin offered to help. This time he promised himself he would be there for the whole project and for all the projects to come. After all, bridges could be rebuilt, one plank at a time.